The corridor smelled of tallow and boiled mutton, and the flagstones held the November cold the way old grief holds a house, not visibly, but in every draught that found the ankles. She had been standing in that corridor for 11 minutes by the long case clock at its far end, her trunk still roped shut at her feet, when the housekeeper turned from the assembled row of maids and footmen and looked at her the way one looks at a stain discovered on a good tablecloth. "A companion wears wool," the housekeeper said, "not silk." Her eyes moved once, deliberately, from the crown of the newcomer's bonnet to the hem of her traveling dress, as though counting the cost of the cloth and finding it wanting, even before she had finished speaking. "I had heard the new companion came with 2 morning gowns to her name. I did not credit it until I saw for myself." No one in the row of servants laughed, though 2 of the younger maids exchanged a glance that carried the same weight as laughter. The butler, a tall man with the stillness of long service in his shoulders, did not look up from the ledger he pretended to study. "You will take your meals in the still room," the housekeeper went on, "and not at the table below stairs, where those in service to this house have earned their place through years, not through the charity of a dying woman's whim," she said. Dying woman. The way one says a word that has already been forgiven itself for its cruelty. "The still room is warm enough. It will do." The companion said nothing. She had learned, in the 11 months since her father's death, and the 6 weeks since the solicitor's letter, that named her penniless, in terms so precise she had read them 3 times to be certain of their meaning, that silence cost nothing and revealed nothing, whereas a single word, poorly chosen, could be turned over for a fortnight in a servants' hall, hungry for material. So she stood, her hands folded before her in gloves that had been mended twice at the seam, and she let the housekeeper's gaze pass over her without flinching, without color rising to her face, without the small performance of humility that would have satisfied the room and ended the moment sooner. It was this, the stillness, not the poverty, that seemed to unsettle the housekeeper more than any answer could have. She had expected tears, or at least the trembling chin of a woman new to service and its cruelties. She got instead a pair of steady gray eyes that neither pleaded nor accused, and a silence so complete it felt, to at least one person watching from the shadow of the staircase above, less like defeat than like the held breath before a door is opened. That person did not speak. He had not yet been seen, but he had heard every word, and he did not move from the landing until the corridor below had emptied, and the trunk, at last, was carried away toward the still room's narrow door. It had begun, that morning, some 6 hours before the housekeeper's tongue found its edge, with rain of a particular Derbyshire persistence, not the dramatic downpour of novels, but a fine, gray insistence that soaked through wool before a traveler noticed she was wet at all. The coach had left the market town at 7, its wheels finding every rut the frost had left behind, and she had sat with her trunk wedged against her knees because the driver had not troubled himself to secure it properly, and because she had not asked him twice. The trunk was small. This, she had noted with a kind of private arithmetic she performed often now, the way some women counted stitches or coins. 1 trunk, 2 dresses, a Bible that had been her mother's, 3 handkerchiefs, a comb missing 4 teeth. The dresses were wool, dyed the flat black of mourning that had gone on 2 years longer than grief required, because black did not show wear the way gray did, and because she had not the means to dye them back to some gentler color, even had propriety permitted it. She had let out the seams herself in the autumn, by candlelight, when the letters offering her the position had finally come. 3 of them, all from households that wanted a companion who could read aloud without tiring and mend linen without complaint, and none of which had mentioned wages until she had written to ask, plainly, as though the asking cost her nothing. It had cost her something. She had watched the hedgerows blur past the coach window, black with rain, and had made herself a small promise, the kind she did not say aloud even to herself in full sentences, but which sat in her chest with the weight of a decision already made. She would not be pitied. She had seen what pity did to women in her position, how it curdled, over months, into something closer to contempt, how a household's kindness toward a poor relation or a hired companion had a way of curdling once the novelty wore thin. She had rather be thought proud than be thought pathetic. Pride, at least, a person could carry alone. She had arrived at the hall at 2:30, her hem heavy with damp, and had stood in the servants' entrance for the better part of 20 minutes before anyone came to receive her, watching a boy carry in wood for the kitchen fire and listening to the particular silence of a house that had not yet decided what to make of her. She had not sat down, though there was a bench. She had thought, if she sat, it would look like waiting to be told what she was. She had been right, as it turned out, to remain standing. It had not saved her from the housekeeper's tongue in the hall an hour later. Nothing, she understood now, would have saved her from that, but it had meant she met the woman's contempt already upright, already composed, already, in the smallest possible way, her own. Mrs. Pruitt did not send her to the servants' table after all. That much had been made plain within the hour, delivered not as an apology, but as a further correction, as though the first humiliation had left some untidiness that required tidying. A companion, the housekeeper said, did not dine with the upper staff, nor with the lower, but took her meals apart, in the still room, where the cordials were kept, and the air smelled of dried lavender and beeswax and something faintly medicinal beneath it, like a cupboard that had once held a sick-room's remedies and never quite lost the memory of illness. She was given a plate of cold mutton, a heel of bread, a cup of tea gone tepid before it reached her, and she ate it standing at first, out of some old, stubborn instinct, before she made herself sit, because standing now would have been its own kind of performance, and she was tired of performing anything at all. The still room shared a wall with the corridor that led toward the family apartments, and the wall was thin in the way old houses' walls are thin, not through carelessness, but through age, through plaster that had shrunk and settled over 100 years until sound passed through it like water through cloth. She heard, without meaning to, the particular percussion of boots on stone, unhurried, certain of their right to the space they crossed. She heard a door. She heard voices. Mrs. Pruitt's among them, pitched into a register of deference she had not yet heard the woman use, all its hard edges filed away, and beneath it, threading through it, a voice she did not recognize. It was low, unaccustomed to raising itself, she thought, in the way of men who had never needed to be loud to be obeyed. There was something in it that did not belong entirely to England, a faint, deliberate precision to certain vowels, as though the voice had spent recent months forming itself around a foreign tongue and had not yet shed the habit. She could not make out whole sentences through the plaster, only fragments, rhythms, the occasional hard consonant of a name she did not know. She thought of the coachman's remark from the road, tossed over his shoulder without much interest, that the master had come back from Vienna not a fortnight since, and was not, by report, a man given to conversation. She set down her cup. She told herself the small, private thrill she felt at the sound of that voice through the wall was nothing more than the ordinary curiosity of a stranger in a strange house, the wish to put a face to a name that governed everything around her, down to the mutton on her plate and the wool upon her back. She told herself this several times, with the particular firmness of a person who does not quite believe what she is telling herself, and she went on listening anyway, long after the voices had moved off down the corridor, and the house had returned to its usual creaking silence, leaving her with nothing but the shape of a voice, and no face at all to put to it. Morning came gray and patient, the kind of light that made no promises, and she used the hour before she was wanted to learn the shape of the house that now owned her days. She had been told, in the housekeeper's flattened voice, that a companion did not wander, but no one had said she could not walk with purpose from one appointed task to another, and so she walked slowly and looked. The East Gallery held portraits she had not been told to avoid, and so she studied them, rows of Ashworths in dark coats and darker eyes, and at the end, 3 canvases draped in Holland cloth, undisturbed, as though someone had decided grief could be managed by denying it light. She did not touch the cloth. She noted only that the dust upon the floor beneath them was thinner than elsewhere, as if a hand passed that way often, alone, and stood for a while before moving on. The west wing door was locked. She discovered this not by trying it. She was not so bold, not yet, but, By watching a maid approach it with a tray, hesitate, and turn back the way she had come, the tray still full. When Margaret asked, mildly, whether the tray had been meant for someone within, the maid's face closed like a shutter, and she said only that some rooms kept their own hours, and went on her way. It was in the housekeeper's small office off the kitchen passage, empty at that hour, the fire not yet laid, that she saw the ledger. It lay open upon the desk, weighted by a brass candlestick, its columns ruled in a hand, so precise it seemed almost a rebuke to disorder itself. She had not meant to read it, she told herself this afterward, and it was nearly true, but her eye, trained by years of keeping her own meager accounts, went to figures before she could stop it, and from figures to the headings above them: stores, linen room, morning goods. The last entry beneath that final heading was dated some 18 months past, and the quantity recorded was large and precise, and had not been added to since. She stood a moment longer than was wise. Somewhere behind her a door opened and closed, and she left the room quickly, without disturbing the candlestick, carrying the words with her the way one carries a smell, not understood, only noticed, and impossible to set down again. She thought of the shrouded portraits, and the locked wing, and the ledger's careful hand recording goods that no one, apparently, had touched in a year and a half, and she began, without quite admitting it to herself, to understand that this house did not merely mourn in the ordinary way of houses. It kept its mourning under lock, in rooms with their own hours, in cloth that no one dared use, and in a linen room she had not yet seen, but which she suspected, with the same quiet instinct that had once told her which ledgers concealed a debtor's shame, she would come to know a great deal better before the year was out. The summons came before she had eaten. A maid found her on the stair, breathless with the particular urgency of someone relaying an order she did not fully understand herself, and said only that the old lady would see her now, not after breakfast, not when she had composed herself, now, in the small sitting room above the east gallery, where the fire had been lit since 5. The room was warm, in a way the rest of the house was not, and it smelled of camphor and dried lavender, and something older beneath both, like paper kept too long in a drawer. The dowager sat with her back to the window, so that the light fell on her visitor and not on her, a positioning Margaret understood at once to be deliberate. She was small in the chair, wrapped in shawls the color of weak tea, and her eyes, when they lifted, were entirely unclouded by age. "Sit," she said, and then, before Margaret had settled, "You are the niece of Mrs. Cordelia Hale, of Bath." It was not a question, but Margaret answered as though it were. "I am, madam." She read Greek. Badly, I am told, but she read it. Do you? Enough to know when a translation has been done in haste. Something moved at the corner of the old woman's mouth. Not quite a smile, but its ancestor. "Your aunt owed me £11 for a set of Herodotus she never returned. I do not expect you to settle the debt." "I would offer to, madam, if I had £11, or Herodotus." "You have neither. You have, I am told, 2 dresses of wool, and a great deal of opinion about ledgers." The dowager's gaze did not waver. "Mrs. Pruitt reports everything to me. It is the one useful habit she has left." Margaret said nothing, which seemed, from the slight incline of the old woman's head, to be the correct answer. "What do you read, when no one requires you to read to them?" "Accounts, madam, old ones, if the house has them, and no one minds my looking." "And what do you make of this house's accounts?" The question hung a moment, waited more than its phrasing suggested. Margaret thought of the ledger, the locked room, the unbroken seal on 18 months of mourning goods, and chose the plain truth over the safe one. That grief here has been kept as carefully as money, and spent as little. The dowager's hands, folded in her lap, went still. For a long moment she studied Margaret with the frank, assessing patience of a woman who had long ago stopped pretending politeness was the same as kindness. "You will do," she said at last, as though concluding an argument she had been having with herself since Margaret entered. "Come again tomorrow. Bring nothing wool." Margaret carried the dowager's parting words down the long gallery, like something warm cupped against a draught, and did not notice, until she had nearly passed it, that the still room door stood ajar, its light spilling thin and yellow across the stone. She did not stop. She had learned, in 6 weeks of service, that a companion who paused at open doors was a companion who invited suspicion, and so she walked on with her eyes forward and her hands folded, and it was only the voices, pitched low, but not low enough, that slowed her step without her willing it. "And I told her plainly," Mrs. Pruitt was saying, to some other servant Margaret could not see, "a companion wears wool. It is not cruelty, it is order. A woman does not forget her place, merely because her employer forgets it for her." A pause, filled with the scrape of a spoon against crockery. "Silk is for those born to carry it. The girl will look a fool in it, mark me, however fine the cut." The other voice murmured something Margaret could not catch. Assent, perhaps, or the careful non-answer servants gave to opinions they did not wish to inherit. Margaret did not linger to hear more. She had heard enough of Mrs. Pruitt's judgments to know the shape of the rest without needing the words, and there was a peculiar mercy in that. It meant she could keep walking, chin level, without the added indignity of standing rooted in a corridor to receive her own humiliation twice in one day. She thought, as she went, of the wool at home in Cumberland, sensible, gray, mended twice at the elbow, and found she did not mind it as much as she once had. Wool did not pretend. Wool asked nothing of her but warmth. She did not see the shadow that fell across the flagstones a little farther on, cast long by a single candle held at shoulder height, nor the figure who had stopped just beyond the still-room threshold, close enough to have heard every word Mrs. Pruitt had offered so freely to the kitchen air. She did not see his face, whether it hardened, whether it softened, whether it did anything at all. There was no one in that corridor to witness it, and the story, for once, declined to look. What there was, instead, was sound. The particular groan of the third floorboard past the linen press, the one every servant in the house had learned by instinct to avoid, worn thin by 2 centuries of careful feet. It cracked once beneath a tread too deliberate to be careless, and then there was nothing, no footsteps returning, no door opening further, only the candle's light withdrawing down the passage the way tide withdraws from sand, leaving the still room's glow to spill alone across the stone, and Margaret, 3 turnings away, unaware that she had just been overheard being spoken of by a man whose silence, had she known to listen for it, would have told her more than any speech he had yet made her. Morning arrived gray and ordinary, which was, Margaret would later think, the strangest part of it, that a day beginning with such unremarkable weather should carry inside it the first small fracture of everything that came after. She had woken before the bell, as was her habit, and dressed by the thin light coming through curtains too thin to keep out the cold, and gone down to find the household already disturbed in a manner she could not at first name. It was not noise, it was the absence of the housekeeper's usual rhythm, the particular cadence of her step, brisk and certain, that governed the passage outside the breakfast room, the way a metronome governs a hand at the pianoforte. That morning the step was there but wrong, hesitating at the sideboard, pausing at the linen cupboard, returning twice to a letter that lay open upon the hall table, as though its contents might rearrange themselves if given sufficient scrutiny. She did not know then what the letter contained. She learned only pieces, and only because the housekeeper's composure, so carefully worn, so seldom slipped, had thinned enough that morning to let something show through the seams. A footman mentioned, in passing, that a rider had gone out before dawn, carrying correspondence to be posted express, a courtesy reserved, in Margaret's limited understanding of the house, for matters of business or grief. The housekeeper, overhearing this, turned upon the boy with a sharpness that startled him into silence, though her eyes, when they moved past him to Margaret, held something less like anger than confusion, the look of a woman accustomed to knowing the contents of every drawer in a house, discovering, for the first time in some years, a lock to which she had not been given the key. No one told Margaret why a tailor's name had entered the servants' hall that morning, spoken first by the housekeeper herself in a tone of barely concealed irritation, as though the word were a stone lodged unexpectedly in a shoe. No one told her the tailor was engaged from London, nor for what purpose, nor whose measurements he was expected to take upon his arrival. She gathered only fragments, a date mentioned twice, a sum referenced once, and then hastily unreferenced, the housekeeper's insistence to the cook that no such order had come through her hand, and must therefore be some misunderstanding to be corrected before it reached his Grace's attention. Margaret said nothing. She had learned, in 3 months beneath that roof, that silence served her better than curiosity, and that questions asked too early were questions answered too late, if answered at all. But she noted, as she carried the dowager's tray up the east stair, that the housekeeper's authority, once so absolute it required no raising of the voice, had begun, that morning, to require exactly that. The tailor arrived at 10:30 on a Tuesday, made colder by a wind that had turned during the night, bringing with it a fine gray rain that beaded on the window panes of the small parlor set aside for his use. He was a narrow man with narrow instruments, precise in his movements as a man handling something that might break if mishandled, and he spoke little beyond what his measuring required. A tape here, a pause, a number murmured to the boy who wrote it down in a ledger, bound in green leather, the kind of ledger that suggested this was not his first commission of the week, nor his most difficult. She stood as instructed, arms slightly lifted, and felt the tape pass across her shoulders, like a question she had not been asked directly. "I require nothing beyond what I have," she said, to no one in particular, though the tailor's assistant glanced up briefly before returning to his figures. "2 dresses, wool. They have served." The tailor said nothing, which she had come to understand was its own kind of answer in that house, a silence that did not argue, because it had already been overruled elsewhere, in a room she had not been present in, by a voice she had not heard raised. It was the dowager who answered, from the chair by the window where she had installed herself with a rug across her knees, and an expression of mild, unbothered interest, as though she were watching weather rather than a woman's protest. "Nonsense," the dowager said. "You will stand still and let the man do his work. I did not ask for this." "No," the dowager agreed, not unkindly, "which is precisely why it is worth having. The things we ask for are rarely the things we need. I have found that true of husbands, physicians, and dresses alike." She turned her face toward the gray window, as though the rain itself required her attention, and added, more quietly, "Call it a kindness, if the word troubles you less than gratitude does. I have found some people can accept a kindness who cannot accept a gift." Margaret did not answer that. She had learned, too, that the dowager's kindnesses arrived already decided, requiring only her cooperation and not her consent, and there was a comfort in that as much as a discomfort, the comfort of a decision made by someone with the authority to make it, so that no one need ask what right she had to silk. The tailor's tape moved again, along the length of her arm, and she held still, watching the rain gather and slide down the glass in threads that broke and rejoined, and thought of nothing in particular, except that somewhere below stairs, a woman was at that very hour recalculating the exact shape of her own authority, and had not yet arrived at the number. The fitting concluded before the rain did, and the tailor departed with his pins and his measured silences, leaving the companion to find her own way back through corridors grown unfamiliar with dusk. It was on that walk that a maid, harried and short of breath, pressed a folded note into her hand, the housekeeper's script, brisk and unlovely, requesting spare bedding be brought up from the linen room, the under-housemaid being occupied elsewhere, and no one else at leisure to fetch it. The companion did not think to refuse. She had learned already that a companion's leisure belonged to whoever named it first. The linen room lay at the end of a passage seldom used, its door heavier than its purpose seemed to warrant, its lock stiff with disuse. She turned the key twice before it yielded, and the smell that met her was not the clean, starched smell she had expected of sheets and pillow slips, but something older, cedar and dust, and beneath it, a faint sweetness like pressed flowers gone dry in a book. Shelves rose to the ceiling on either side, most bare, a few holding folded linens with the particular gray pallor of things stored too long. She did not find the bedding at once. She found, instead, a low chest at the far end, its lid not quite closed, a corner of dust sheet trailing from beneath it, like something that had tried, and failed, to escape. She should not have lifted the sheet. She told herself this, even as her hand did it. Beneath lay bolts of silk, stacked with a care that spoke of hands far gentler than the room's general neglect suggested. A deep blue-green, the color of water under ice, or of a lake at that hour before evening becomes night. The light was poor, and still the color seemed to hold its own light, a color she had no name for, precisely because it changed as she looked at it. Blue in one fold, and green in the next, and something else besides that she could not place, some undertone that made her think, absurdly, of standing too near a hearth after being cold too long. She did not touch it. She found she did not want to, though she could not have said why the wanting mattered, or why its absence felt like caution rather than indifference. A chill moved along her arms that owed nothing to the room's temperature, which was, if anything, close and still. She stood a moment longer than the errand required, listening to nothing, no footstep, no voice, only the small sound of rain, continuing somewhere beyond the shuttered window, and then she drew the dust sheet back over the chest, not neatly, for her hands were not quite steady enough for neatness, and found the bedding at last on a shelf nearer the door, where it had been the whole time, in plain sight, waiting for someone who was not looking for it. The bedding gathered against her chest, she turned toward the door with the ordinary intention of leaving, and it was in that turning that she found the housekeeper filling the frame, though she had heard no approach, no rustle of skirts on the stair, nothing to announce that she had ceased to be alone. "You've no business in here." The voice was not raised. It did not need to be. There was a quality to it that struck harder than volume could have. A thinness, almost, as though the words had been pulled through something narrow before they reached the air. "I was sent for linen. The housemaid said it was kept. I know what it's kept for." The housekeeper's eyes went past her, to the dust sheet, to the corner of the chest just visible beneath it, not squarely covered as it had been, and something crossed her face that Margaret would spend the rest of the evening trying to name and failing. Not anger exactly, not even suspicion, something closer to the look of a woman who has walked into a room expecting it empty and found instead that the dead have moved the furniture. She crossed the room in 3 steps, quicker than her age or her usual measured tread would have suggested, and drew the sheet fully over the chest herself, tucking its edges down with hands that were, Margaret noticed, not entirely steady either. A small mercy, that she was not alone in that particular unsteadiness, though it brought no comfort with it. "This room is not on your rounds," the housekeeper said, straightening. "It will not be on your rounds. Do you understand me?" "I understand that I was told to fetch linen, and did." "Then fetch it and go." She had already reached past Margaret to pull the door, not held it open in courtesy, but drew it shut behind them both with a sound sharper than the moment seemed to call for, a crack of wood against frame that made the housemaid 2 rooms distant look up from her polishing, and then quickly down again, as though she had learned long ago which sounds in this house were safe to notice, and which were not. They stood a moment in the corridor, the bedding still gathered in Margaret's arms, the housekeeper's hand still flat against the door, as though she meant to hold it shut by will alone. "You'll say nothing of what's kept in there," she said at last, and it was not quite a request. "I saw very little." "You saw enough." The hand came away from the door. The composure that had governed every syllable Margaret had heard from her since the first morning's humiliation reassembled itself visibly, plate by plate, until the housekeeper was once more the woman who ruled linen and silver and the small tyrannies of below-stairs life with unbroken certainty. But it had cracked. Margaret had seen it crack, and the housekeeper knew she had seen it, and neither of them said so as they went their separate ways down the corridor, the rain still falling beyond the shuttered windows, patient and indifferent to what either of them had just understood. The housemaid she found again 3 days later, in the still room where the jars of preserved plums stood in ranks, like soldiers awaiting inspection, and where the girl was decanting vinegar with the particular carefulness of someone who has been taught that mistakes here cost more than broken crockery upstairs. She was perhaps 16, with reddened knuckles and a way of glancing at the door before she spoke, as though the walls themselves reported to the housekeeper. Margaret did not ask outright. She had learned, in 3 weeks at Ashworth Hall, that directness frightened the frightened, and that the below-stairs world moved by increments, the same way trust moved anywhere. She spoke first of the vinegar, then of the rain, then, lightly, as though it hardly mattered, of the color she had glimpsed through the door before it closed. Blue-green, she said, like a duck's wing in low light. Had the girl ever seen fabric such as that in the house? The maid's hands stilled over the funnel. "That's her Grace's color," she said, so quietly that Margaret had to lean toward her to be certain of the words at all. There was no need to ask which Grace. There was only one who had ever been spoken of in that hushed, backward-looking tense that servants use for the dead, who are not permitted to be forgotten, and not permitted to be mourned aloud either. Her Grace favored it, the girl went on, encouraged perhaps by the silence Margaret offered her, the silence that asked nothing, and therefore invited everything. Always that color, in ribbons, in gowns, in the drapery of her own rooms before. She stopped herself the way one stops a cart before a drop in the road, both hands coming up as if to catch back what had already left her. "Before," Margaret said, gently, though she already understood that gentleness was a kind of trespass here. But the girl's face had closed like a shutter drawn against weather. She looked again at the door, and this time her look held something sharper than caution. It held the particular fear of a person who has watched another person's punishment and measured her own vulnerability against it. "I've said too much," she whispered. "Mrs. Pruitt would have my place if she knew I'd spoken of it at all. Please, I beg you won't say I told you." Margaret assured her she would not, and meant it, and watched the girl return to her vinegar, with hands that trembled only slightly, the trembling of someone relieved and still afraid in equal measure. She carried the words back up the narrow stair with her. "Her Grace's color," turning them the way one turns a coin, to see whether it is truly silver or only silvered, weighing what they explained and what they left, deliberately, dangerously unexplained. The rain had not ceased in 3 days. It fell now against the corridor windows, with the same patient indifference it had shown the night she had stood outside the locked door, and she understood, with a clarity that unsettled her more than the housekeeper's cruelty ever had, that she had been given not an answer, but the outline of a question far larger than any wardrobe. The dowager received her the following afternoon in the small parlor overlooking the east garden, where the rain had softened at last into a gray drizzle that made the boxwood hedges glisten like things dipped in wax. The tea had gone cold between them before either woman touched it, and Margaret understood this was not carelessness but design, that the old woman preferred the ritual of pouring to the pleasure of drinking, and used the pot as other people used silence. "You've been to see the modiste," the dowager said, not as a question. "I have, Your Grace." "And what did she show you?" The old woman's eyes, pale and quick as a bird's, did not leave Margaret's face. "Colors, I imagine." "Fabrics laid across your arm so you might see how they took the light." Margaret said that she had. "There was a teal among them, I should think, a particular shade, not blue enough for a peacock's neck, not green enough for a beetle's back. Something in between, that only shows its true color in certain lights." She said this lightly, stirring a tea she did not intend to drink, but her gaze had sharpened to something almost surgical, and Margaret felt herself being read as one reads a ledger for an error not yet named. "My daughter-in-law wore that color until it could not be found in any decent shop in London, and then she had it made specially, twice a year, from a man in Spitalfields who is dead now and left no apprentice worth the name." "I did see such a color, Your Grace." "Did you?" The old woman's mouth did something that was not quite a smile. "And what did you think of it?" Margaret weighed her answer the way she had weighed the maid's whispered words the night before, turning it for the false ring of flattery, or the truer ring of caution. "I thought it beautiful," she said carefully, "and I thought it strange that a companion should be fitted for a color a lady chose." "Strange," the dowager repeated, as though testing the word's weight. She set down her spoon with a small, precise click against the saucer. "Yes, I imagine it would seem so, to someone who does not yet understand this house." She did not say more. She poured tea neither of them would drink, and watched the drizzle blur the hedges beyond the glass, and for a long moment Margaret thought the conversation had ended, folded shut like a letter not meant to be finished. Then the old woman said, without looking at her, "Grief makes a man do peculiar arithmetic, my dear. He will spend a fortune to avoid spending a feeling," and woke. And though she said nothing further, offered no name, no confirmation, no absolution, Margaret understood that she had just been told something true and dangerous, and left to determine for herself which of its parts was warning and which was permission. The dowager's words followed her up the stairs like a scent that would not leave the folds of a shawl, and Margaret was still turning them over. He will spend a fortune to avoid spending a feeling. When the maid came to fetch her for the first fitting, her manner brisk in the way of someone who has been told to hurry and does not wish to explain why. The room they used was small and north-facing, chosen, Margaret suspected, for its light rather than its comfort, and the seamstress within it, a narrow woman with a mouth full of pins and a manner that suggested she had dressed better women than this and worse women than this, and found neither occasion remarkable, did not speak beyond instruction. Arms so. Turn. Hold still, if you please. There was no cruelty in it, but no particular kindness either, which Margaret found, unexpectedly, a relief. The dress they slid over her shoulders first was not the silk, it was gray, a plain gray, unremarkable at a glance, the sort of color a companion might reasonably be permitted without occasioning talk. But when the seamstress fastened the last hook at her back and stepped away to consider the line of it, Margaret felt the weight of the fabric settle against her like something with an opinion of its own, and she understood, even before she turned to the glass, that this was not wool cut by a village dressmaker with an eye toward economy. The seams lay flat where her old dresses puckered. The waist did not pull. The sleeve fell from the shoulder in a single unbroken line, as though the cloth had been persuaded, rather than forced into its shape, and when she lifted her arm to test it, nothing resisted her. She turned to the glass because the seamstress told her to, and stood there longer than she meant to. The woman looking back at her was recognizably herself, the same narrow face, the same tired eyes she had carried through 3 years of mourning and worse, but the dress had done something to the posture of her that she had not authorized. She stood straighter in it, or the dress made her seem to. The gray, plain as it was meant to be, caught the window light in a way her wool never had, and for one dizzying moment she could not say with certainty which side of the glass held the companion and which held some other woman entirely, dressed for a life not her own. "It fits," the seamstress said, as though this were a modest achievement rather than an alarming one. "It fits," Margaret repeated, and heard in her own voice the particular unsteadiness of someone who has been told the truth and is not yet sure she believes it. Behind her, through the half-open door, she caught the housekeeper's shape pass in the corridor, pause, and pass on without a word, and something in the silence of that passing told Margaret more plainly than any sneer could have that the gray dress, however plain, had already changed the shape of the house around her. It was in the small hours of the household economy that the housekeeper's displeasure made itself known, for she was too practiced a servant to defy an order given by the master of the house, and too proud a woman to accept it without some private accounting of the cost. The gray dress was delivered, as instructed, with its 2 silk companions to follow within the fortnight. The seamstress was paid, as instructed, from the household purse without complaint entered in the ledger. But the tray that came to the companion's room that evening arrived 3/4 of an hour later than it ought, the tea gone from merely warm to merely wet, and the bread cut thinner than the loaf allowed. No one had ordered this. No one could have proven it ordered at all. The housekeeper's manner toward the staff, sharpened in ways too small to name and too consistent to mistake. She corrected the under-housemaid twice for laying the companion's washing water a degree too hot, though the degree had not troubled her in 3 years prior. She reminded the cook, within the companion's hearing, but not addressed to her, that some in this house ate well who had once been glad of bread and butter, and that gladness, once lost, was rarely regained by those who forgot its taste. She said nothing to the companion directly that a magistrate could have called unkind. She simply arranged, with the long patience of a woman who had run a great house for 11 years, that every small comfort should arrive a little late, a little cold, a little short, and that the companion should understand, without a word spoken, precisely whose hand withheld them. The other servants, watching, learned quickly which way the wind now blew from the housekeeper's quarter, and adjusted their courtesies accordingly, not from cruelty of their own, but from the plain arithmetic of survival in a house where the housekeeper's favor decided who ate first and who waited. The companion noticed this shift the way she noticed most things, quietly, without comment, filing it alongside the other small silences she had learned to read in 3 years of being someone's poor relation in spirit if not in blood. She did not complain. She had learned that complaint, in a house like this, cost more than it purchased. What she did not yet understand, could not yet understand, having arrived only weeks before with 2 mourning dresses and no history of the house, was that the housekeeper's coldness was not the simple malice of a woman jealous of another's rise. It was grief, wearing the shape of authority, the fury of someone who had guarded this household's rules for over a decade, only to watch them dissolve at the whim of a man who had, until 3 weeks past, scarcely spoken a full sentence to her beyond instruction. The keys at her waist had never felt heavier, though nothing yet had been taken from her hand. Not yet. The library at Ashworth Hall kept its own weather, separate from the rest of the house, colder in summer, warmer in the depths of winter, as though the books themselves regulated the air by some private agreement no servant had ever explained to her. She had gone there, in the hour before dinner, when the household's attention turned toward trays and tureens, hoping to find something to read that would not remind her of her own reduced circumstances. She had not expected him. He stood at the far shelf, with his back to the door, a book open in his hands, and something in the stillness of his shoulders told her she had interrupted a private thing before she had made a sound. She stopped in the doorway. He did not turn. "You've found the one room in this house no one thinks to look for me in," he said, not as a greeting, but as an observation made to the shelves. "I did not know it was spoken for, Your Grace." She kept her voice level. "I shall come again, another hour." "You needn't." He closed the book, though not before she saw the color of its binding, a deep, faded blue, the kind of blue that had once been expensive and was now simply old. "It is a library. Its purpose is to be entered." She stepped forward despite herself, some old habit of curiosity overriding the newer habit of caution. "What is it you were reading?" A pause, longer than the question warranted. A record of household accounts, nothing of consequence. It was not a record of household accounts. She had seen enough ledgers in her father's study to know the shape of one from across a room, and this was not that shape. Too slender, too soft-spined, bearing on its cover, she now saw, the ghost of initials she could not quite make out from the distance he kept between them. She said nothing of this. She had learned, in 3 years of being tolerated rather than wanted, that some doors were not hers to open even when she could see the room beyond them. "Forgive the intrusion," she said instead, and turned to go. "You've done nothing requiring forgiveness." His voice, when it came, had lost its earlier flatness, though only by a degree so small she might have imagined it. "That distinction belongs to fewer people in this house than you'd think." She did not know what to make of that, and he did not offer to help her make anything of it. He set the slender book back upon the shelf with a care that seemed disproportionate to a record of household accounts, squared it precisely against its neighbors, and walked past her toward the door without another word, leaving her alone with the blue spine, the cold hearth, and the distinct, uneasy sense that she had been permitted to witness something he had not intended to be witnessed at all. She did not leave at once, though she had said she would, though the sensible course was to close the door behind her and let the room return to whatever silence it had kept before she disturbed it. Instead, she stood a moment longer, and in that moment her eye, trained by 3 years of counting linens and noting which teacups had chips before the housekeeper could blame her for them, moved without her permission across the rest of the shelf. A pair of spectacles lay folded upon a stack of bound sermons, their wire frames gone dull with the particular tarnish that comes not from use but from disuse, from sitting untouched in the same warm, dry air for longer than anyone had troubled to move them. She did not need to be told whose they had been. No one had worn spectacles like that in this house in the whole of her tenure, and certainly not the Duke, whose sight, she had observed at dinner, was keen enough to find fault with a crooked place setting from the far end of a long table. Beside the spectacles, wedged into the pages of a slim volume of botanical plates, something pale had left its shadow through the paper, pressed so long ago that the outline of it, a 5-petaled flower she could not name, had bled faintly into the leaves on either side, like a stain that had given up trying to be removed. She did not touch the book. She had already trespassed further than she'd intended, and there was a difference, she thought, between witnessing a room and disturbing it. What struck her, standing there with the cold hearth at her back, was not any single object, but the arrangement of them, the way the spectacles sat exactly where a hand might have set them down between one page and the next, the way the flower had been pressed and never retrieved, the way the whole shelf held itself like a sentence left unfinished on purpose. 3 years, she had heard whispered once by a housemaid too young to know better than to whisper it at all. 3 years since the Duchess had gone out of the house and not returned to it, and here, apparently, was proof that no one had gone into this room since to finish what she had left half done. It was not grief exactly that Margaret felt, standing amid another woman's abandoned reading. It was something colder and more precise, the sensation of a ledger that had never been closed, entries left open on a page no one had dared to turn. She thought of the account book with its faded initials, set back upon its shelf with that same disproportionate care, and understood, with the sudden clarity of a governess totaling sums, that she had wandered by accident into the one room in Ashworth Hall where time had simply stopped, and that the man who kept it locked was not preserving a memory so much as guarding a wound he had never once allowed to close. She had not meant to remain there so long. The candle in the sconce had burned down a full inch by the time she withdrew from the room, closed the door with the same care she had used to open it, and returned the key to its hook behind the tapestry as though her hand had never touched it at all. It was this care, this scrupulous restoration of every object to its precise former position, that occupied her mind as she climbed the back stair to the small chamber allotted her, so much so that she did not, at first, see what lay across the foot of the bed. It was a gown. She stood in the doorway a long moment before she trusted herself to approach it, for the candlelight did something to the fabric that she distrusted on principle, having learned early in life not to credit the evidence of flattering light. But, when she came nearer and lifted the sleeve between 2 fingers, the color did not soften or apologize for itself. It held, deep as a pond in shadow, green enough to be called blue by some, and blue enough to be called green by others. The silk took the candle flame and gave it back transformed, the way water gives back the moon. She had seen this color before. She had seen it not an hour past, folded in a chest in a locked room no one entered, laid beneath tissue that had gone brittle with disuse, beside a book with a flower pressed and forgotten between its pages. Her hand did not shake, precisely. But she set the sleeve down with more deliberation than the action required, as one sets down a cup one has just realized is cracked. The tailor's note, pinned discreetly to the bodice, gave no explanation beyond a date and a signature she did not recognize. It did not need to give more. She understood, with the same cold arithmetic that had served her over the account books, and the flower, and the shelf that held itself like an unfinished sentence, that the fabric had not been chosen from a merchant's ordinary stock, matched idly to her complexion or her station. It had been matched to something already in the house, something guarded, something that had not seen daylight, by all evidence, in 3 years. She thought of Mrs. Pruitt's voice in the front hall on her first morning. A companion wears wool, not silk, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the memory no longer stung so much as it now seemed almost innocent, a small cruelty, dwarfed by a larger and stranger one she had not yet named. She did not touch the gown again that night. She sat instead in the chair by the window, watching the candle gutter, turning over in her mind the question she was not yet prepared to ask aloud, whether she had been given a wardrobe or fitted, without her knowledge, into the shape of someone else entirely. She found the dowager the next morning in the small parlor where the light came in pale and unkind, through curtains not yet drawn against the day, a shawl doubled over her knees, though the fire had already been laid an hour. Margaret did not sit until she was asked, and when she was asked, she did not soften her question with the preamble she had rehearsed twice on the stairs. "The color of the silk," she said. "I should like to know whose it was." The dowager did not pretend surprise. She folded her hands over the shawl as though folding away an argument she had known would come to her eventually, and for a long moment she looked at Margaret with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite warning. "It was hers," she said at last. "The Duchess's. It was the color she wore the year she came out, and the year she married him, and I believe the year she died, though I did not see her that last time. No one did, by then, but him." She paused. "It was known in this house as her color before it was known as any color at all. There is not a woman in 3 counties who does not remember it on her." Margaret's hands did not move in her lap, though she felt something in her chest draw tight, the way a rope draws tight before it is asked to bear weight. "Then you understand why I would ask what he intends by it. I understand why you would fear the answer." The dowager's voice gentled, though it did not waver. "But you mistake him if you think this is a haunting, dressed as a kindness. My son does not traffic in ghosts for sport. Whatever this is, and I will not pretend to you that I know the whole of it, for he has told me less than you imagine, it is not cruelty, and it is not carelessness. He has thought on this longer than the fitting took. But you will not tell me what it is." "Because I do not fully know," the dowager said, and here, for the first time, something in her composure slipped, not far, but enough to be seen. "I have buried a daughter-in-law I loved, and I have watched my son go 3 years without speaking her name in this house. I will not pretend to you that I understand what moves in him now, only that something does, and that it moves toward you, and not away." She reached for her tea, found it cold, and did not ring for more. "Wear the gown, or do not," she said. "But do not mistake my silence for an answer I am withholding. I have none to give you." Margaret returned to her room with the dowager's words sitting heavier in her chest than the silence that had followed them. The 2 wool dresses lay across the bed where she had left them that morning, their collars worn soft from years of careful mending, and she looked at them the way one looks at an old friend one is about to disappoint. She took the smaller trunk from beneath the bed and began, with the same deliberate economy she brought to every task, to fold them back into it, the gray first, then the black, then the shawl that had belonged to her mother, its fringe thinned to almost nothing. She told herself it was a matter of principle. A companion did not dress as a duchess had dressed. A companion did not sit at a table beneath candlelight in silk, chosen to answer some old grief that was none of her business to carry. She told herself this while her hands moved with more force than folding required, and she did not examine too closely why the telling did not settle her. She had closed the trunk and was fastening the strap when she stopped, her fingers still on the buckle, and thought of the dowager's tea gone cold on the table because she would not ring for more. A small thing, but it stayed with Margaret the way small things do when larger ones refuse to be held. "I have buried a daughter I loved." The old woman had not asked Margaret to wear the silk for the Duke's sake, nor even, perhaps, for her own. She had asked, in her sideways manner, that Margaret not mistake pride for virtue. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed with the trunk strap still under her hand, and considered, honestly, for the first time, what refusing the gown would accomplish. It would not undo the fitting, nor erase whatever memory had moved through the Duke when he chose the color. It would only return her to the servants' hall in wool, proving nothing to anyone but herself, and proving it, she admitted slowly, more for the comfort of feeling wronged than for any dignity actually restored. There was a vanity in refusal, as surely as there was in vanity's plainer forms. She had simply never before had occasion to meet it in herself. She unbuckled the strap. She did not take the dresses out again, not yet, but she left the trunk unlatched on the floor, a door held ajar rather than shut, and sat a long while in the fading light before she rose to see what the tailor's girl had left folded in paper on the chair. The rain came first, before the carriages, a fine, persistent rain that darkened the gravel drive and set the footmen scrambling with umbrellas that did little good against wind coming sideways off the park. By 4 o'clock, the hall echoed with the particular chaos of arrival, trunks thumping down from carriage roofs, a spaniel barking somewhere near the stairs, voices pitched high with the false brightness of travelers, relieved to be indoors. Mrs. Pruitt moved through it with the rigid competence of a woman performing her duties for what she suspected might be among the last times anyone would trouble to notice them. Upstairs, the tailor's girl fastened the last hook at the small of her back and stepped away to let her look. The teal fell from her shoulders in a single unbroken line, catching what light the window offered, and returning it changed. Deeper, warmer, the color of something remembered rather than simply seen. She did not recognize herself in the glass, not entirely, and she understood this was not vanity's failure, but its opposite. She was looking at a woman she had not yet decided how to become. She went down at the appointed hour with her chin at the angle she had practiced in worse rooms than this one. The dining room had been laid for 14, silver multiplied along the white cloth, candlelight doing its old trick of making every face seem younger and more sincere than daylight would allow. She found her name, her own name, written in a hand she did not know, on a card beside the Duke's right hand, where custom placed a wife, a sister, someone claimed by blood or law. A murmur passed down the table, quick and then suppressed. "You've placed the companion beside yourself," one guest observed, not quite a question. "I have," the Duke said, and offered nothing further, as though the matter required no more defense than the weather. She sat. She unfolded her napkin with hands that did not shake, though she noted, with the same distant attention she gave everything now, that her pulse had not slowed since the hooks were fastened. Across the table, a lord newly arrived from London studied her with the particular interest men reserved for women they could not immediately place in the ledger of rank, and asked, pleasantly enough, whether she had long kept the house. She met his eyes and did not correct him. Beside her, she felt rather than saw the Duke's attention shift, briefly, toward her silence, toward the choice she had made not to answer plainly, and something in his stillness suggested he understood exactly what she had declined to give away. The London lord, satisfied by her silence as much as any answer, turned to his companion, an older gentleman with a florid face, and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been wrong at a dinner table, and remarked that Ashworth had not seen such gracious hosting since the late Duchess herself presided over it. The older man agreed, raising his glass a fraction toward her. "The Duchess does the house credit," he said, and drank, as though the matter settled itself. She felt the word land in her chest before she understood why it should wound. The Duchess. Not a mistake born of malice, only of assumption, the natural conclusion any stranger would draw, seeing a woman seated where a wife belonged, dressed as a wife might dress, attended as a wife might be attended. She did not look at the Duke. She was aware, with the same sharpened stillness that had not left her since the fitting, that he had not corrected either man, not at the first remark and not at the second, and that his silence now carried a different weight than his silence at the start of the meal. Behind her chair, where the footmen moved in their practiced rhythm of removal and service, Mrs. Pruitt stood with the wine in hand, pouring for the guest at her left, and did not move to pour for the guest at her right. The decanter hung suspended a moment too long. A guest glanced up, waiting. The housekeeper's hand did not tremble, but it also did not proceed, and the pause stretched just long enough for the footman beside her to notice and step forward to finish the pour himself. Mrs. Pruitt withdrew her hand as though she had touched something hot, and resumed her place along the wall with her face arranged into the same composed blankness she wore for funerals and audits alike. Margaret did not see this. She was facing the table, not the wall. But she felt, as one feels weather changing before it arrives, that something in the room had shifted its weight. The Duke, unhurried, lifted his glass and let the conversation move past the remark without amplifying it, the way a man lets a stone sink rather than throw it back across the water. It was not confirmation. It was not correction either. It was the particular silence of a man deciding, in real time, which truth he was willing to let stand uncontested, and Margaret understood, with a clarity that unsettled her more than any insult Mrs. Pruitt had offered in the corridor weeks before, that she had just watched him choose. The candles in the great hall had burned low by the time the last carriage wheels crossed the gravel, and the house exhaled the particular quiet that follows a gathering. Glasses cleared, chairs righted, the smell of beeswax and spent wine hanging in the air like something unfinished. He walked the corridor toward his study, coat still buttoned, when she stepped from the shadow of the linen closet door, with the keys still at her waist. And for the first time in 11 years of service, her voice was not the voice she used for accounts, or for scolding scullery maids. "Your Grace." A pause, and then, without the customary bow of address that softened every sentence she had ever offered him, "Do you mean to replace her, or to bring her back?" He stopped, the single candle in the wall, sconce guttered, throwing her face into a light that made her look older than her ledgers suggested, and younger than her authority allowed. "I have watched you fit that girl in her color," she said. "Seat her in her chair. Let her wear her name at your table without wearing it. I have kept this house since before either of them existed to you. I am asking you plainly, because no one else in this house will." He did not answer at once. His hand rested on the doorframe, and she watched it, watched the knuckles, not the face, the way a woman who has spent a lifetime reading a man's temper by his hands rather than his mouth. When he spoke, it was slow, each word set down like a stone he was not certain would hold weight. "I do not know." It was not the answer she had braced for. She had prepared for denial, for anger, for the cold dismissal she had grown skilled at absorbing and returning in kind. She had not prepared for honesty offered without apology, and it left her with nothing to push against. "That is not a governance," she said finally. "That is a haunting." "Perhaps," he said, "it is both." He did not move to explain further, and she did not ask him to. The candle between them steadied. Somewhere above, a floorboard shifted under a servant's careless step, and the sound seemed to remind them both that they were not, after all, alone in the house, only alone in this particular understanding of it. She inclined her head, not a bow, not quite, and turned back down the corridor toward the kitchen stair, the keys at her waist making their small, familiar sound, though to her own ear, for the first time, they sounded less like authority than like something she was merely still carrying. She had not meant to hear it. The door to the small parlor had stood ajar by no more than the width of a hand, and she had been passing with an armful of linen when the housekeeper's voice, low and unlike its usual iron self, had reached her through the gap. "Governance. You. Haunting. Both." Words that meant nothing whole and everything in pieces. She had stood a long moment in the draught, the linen growing heavy in her arms, and then she had gone on, because there was nothing else to be done with words overheard through a door. But she did not sleep. The house at that hour kept a different silence than by day, not the silence of order but of held breath, as though the walls themselves were listening for something not yet said. She found her way to the long gallery by candle, her shawl pulled close against a chill the fires never quite reached, and there she stopped before the portrait she had passed 100 times without permitting herself to look at fully. The Duchess regarded her from within her gilt frame, with an expression the painter had rendered as serene, though Margaret suspected serenity had cost her something. The silk in the portrait was the same silk now hanging, half finished, on a form in the sewing room 3 floors below. She heard him before she saw him. The particular unhurried tread that she had learned, without meaning to, was his alone. He stopped some distance off, as though the portrait's light held a boundary he chose not to cross uninvited. "You are awake," he said. It was not a question. "I have a question you will not like," she answered, "and I find I would rather ask it badly than not ask it at all." He said nothing, which she had come to understand was not refusal, but permission. "When you look at me," she said, "in that color, do you see me, or do you see her?" The candle between them did not waver, though something in his face did, some small collapse held just short of the surface. He looked past her, briefly, to the portrait, and then back, and the silence that followed was long enough that she counted it. 1 breath, 2, the third caught somewhere in her throat. He did not answer. It was not evasion, she understood. Watching him, it was that he did not yet know, and would not insult her by pretending otherwise. The not knowing sat on him the way grief had sat on him from the first night she had seen him cross the hall in his traveling coat, and she found, standing there in her borrowed candlelight beneath his dead wife's painted eyes, that she could not decide whether his silence frightened her or steadied her, only that it asked something of her she had not yet finished deciding how to give. The Duke moved at last, not toward her, but toward the window, where the night pressed black against the glass, and the rain had softened to something almost gentle. "I do not know," he said finally, and his voice carried none of the coldness the household had learned to expect from him, only a kind of exhausted honesty. "That is the truth of it, and I will not dress it in kinder words for your comfort or mine. I looked at that color for 2 years and saw only absence. Tonight I looked at it and saw you standing inside it, breathing, arguing with me about a question I have no right to leave unanswered. And for one moment, God forgive me, I did not think of her at all." Margaret said nothing. There was nothing yet to say that would not shrink the size of what he had just admitted. "That frightens me more than her ghost ever did," he added, quieter now, "because a ghost asks nothing of a man. You do." She held the silk at her sides, the weight of it suddenly less like ownership and more like a question she had agreed to carry a little longer. "Then we are both undecided," she said. "I find I can live with that, if you can." He looked at her as though she had handed him something he had not expected to be offered, not forgiveness, not certainty, simply room. Down the long corridor, past the closed doors and the cooling grates, Mrs. Pruitt stood where she had stood for some minutes, unseen, her hand resting on the ring of keys at her waist, as it had rested every night for 11 years, through mistresses, married and buried, through a house that had once obeyed her smallest word. She had come to report a matter of linen, some trivial complaint she could no longer afterward recall, and had instead heard a companion in borrowed silk ask the Duke a question no housekeeper would ever have dared, and receive an answer, not a rebuke, but a silence that changed the house more thoroughly than any order she herself had ever given. She did not weep. She was not a woman given to it, and this was not, she understood, a grief that wanted witnesses. She walked instead to the hall table, where the ledger of the house lay closed beneath a single candle, and set the keys down beside it, gently, without ceremony, the way one lays down a thing that has simply grown too heavy to be worth the pretense of carrying. Then she went up to bed, and did not come down again with the keys in her hand.